"We don't serve women like you," the owner said, and the room agreed without a single word, because out here agreement didn't need voices. It lived in the way men didn't look up, in the way chairs stayed still, in the way no one made space at the bar. When Clara Whitmore stepped inside after a long 10-mile ride through wind and dust that still clung to the hem of her cream blouse and the edges of her worn leather vest, the saloon smelled like stale whiskey and sunburned wood, the kind of place where rules weren't written but never questioned, and Clara paused just long enough to take it in. The low amber light, the slow swing of a ceiling fan that barely pushed the heat, the eyes that watched her from reflections in glass instead of meeting her directly. And still she walked forward, steady, measured, like she had crossed harder ground than this. Her boots quiet against the floorboards that creaked under the weight of men who believed they owned the space simply by sitting in it. The owner didn't lift his gaze as he wiped the same glass again and again, his voice flat, practiced. "We don't serve women like you." As if the sentence had been waiting for her long before she arrived. As if it belonged more to the room than to him. A few men shifted. One let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had any courage behind it. But most stayed still, because cruelty in places like this didn't come loud. It came accepted, and Clara didn't answer right away. She didn't turn, didn't shrink, didn't let the words decide where she stood. Instead, she reached into her pocket and set a single silver coin on the bar. The sound small, clean, cutting through the air sharper than any raised voice. She looked at the glass in the owner's hand, not at his face, and said quietly, "Water," like it was the simplest request a person could make in a town built on thirst. And for a moment nothing moved, not the fan, not the men, not even the dust drifting through the doorway behind her. And somewhere in the back, where shadow gathered near the wall, Elias Carter watched without blinking, his hat tipped low, his posture loose but not relaxed, the kind of stillness that came from knowing exactly how a room could turn without warning. He had seen this before. Different faces, same silence, same mistake. And he didn't look at Clara the way the others did. He looked at the space around her, the way it tightened, the way the air shifted like a storm building without clouds. And when the owner pushed the coin back across the bar with 2 fingers, slow, dismissive, something changed that no one could name yet. Not even the men who felt it settle heavy in their chest. Clara didn't reach for the coin. She let it sit between them. A line drawn without being spoken, and the room held its breath without knowing why. Because out here, sometimes the quiet came before something far heavier than noise, and sometimes the wrong words didn't echo until it was already too late. The coin stayed where it was, untouched, catching the low light like it carried more weight than silver ever should. And Clara Whitmore did not move her hand back toward it. She simply rested her palm flat on the worn wood, as if she had placed something far greater than money between herself and the man across from her. The owner finally looked up then, not out of respect, but out of irritation, his eyes narrowing as though trying to measure her worth in a way that fit the rules he had always followed. But Clara did not give him anything easy to read. Her expression calm, steady, the kind that did not ask permission to exist, and that unsettled him more than defiance ever could. A chair scraped somewhere to her left, slow, uncertain, a man shifting not because he intended to act, but because stillness had begun to feel uncomfortable. The room was changing in small ways, almost invisible, like the moment before a storm when the air grows heavy and even the dust seems to hang in place. Elias Carter pushed himself off the wall in the back, not quickly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift of weight that only a few noticed, but those few felt it. The way one notices when a horse stops grazing and lifts its head towards something unseen. He stepped forward with measured pace, boots landing soft against the boards, his coat brushing lightly against his legs, and he did not look at Clara as he passed her, not because she was not worth seeing, but because he had already seen enough. His attention settled instead on the space ahead, on the door, on the men who suddenly found reasons to stare into their drinks. He reached the entrance and paused for a breath that no one else seemed to take. Then he closed the door, slow, deliberate, the wood meeting the frame with a quiet finality that carried farther than any raised voice. And then came the sound that changed everything, the iron latch. Dropping into place, a simple motion, a small piece of metal falling into a slot. But it echoed through the room like a line being drawn. And for the first time since Clara had walked in, Someone spoke, not loud, not confident, just a question that did not quite form into words, because no one understood why the exit had just been taken away. Elias turned back then, his face unreadable, his eyes steady, not cold, not warm, just certain, and he moved toward the bar without hurry, each step measured as if he was counting something only he could see. The owner straightened, the glass in his hand forgotten, and Clara finally shifted her gaze, not toward the man who had insulted her, but toward the one who had closed the door, and in that brief crossing of silence, something passed between them that did not need language, not agreement, not alliance, just recognition. The kind that comes when two people understand the weight of a moment before anyone else does. Elias reached into his coat and set something on the bar beside the untouched coin, not slammed, not displayed, just placed with quiet precision, and the room leaned closer without meaning to, because whatever had just been set down carried a gravity that no one could ignore, even before they knew what it was. No one reached for the object at first, even though every eye in that room had already locked onto it, because there are things a man recognizes before he understands them, and whatever Elias Carter had placed on that bar carried that kind of recognition. The owner leaned forward slowly, his fingers still wrapped around the cloth he had been using, but now it hung useless, forgotten. His gaze fixed not on Clara anymore, but on the item resting beside her coin, a folded document. Worn at the edges but clean where it mattered, sealed once with authority that had not faded with time, and beside it, a small metal emblem caught the light, not polished, not decorative, just official in a way that could not be faked, the kind of thing that did not need explanation to carry weight. One of the men near the window shifted his hat back slightly, squinting as if distance might change what he was seeing. Another set his glass down without drinking, the sound soft but sharp enough to break whatever illusion of control had been holding the room together. Elias did not speak. He did not point. He simply let the silence do the work, because truth in places like this did not need to be shouted. It only needed space to land, and it landed hard. The owner finally set the cloth down and reached out, hesitating just before his fingers touched the paper, as if contact alone might confirm something he was not ready to accept. But he did touch it, and when he unfolded it, the faint crackle of the material seemed louder than the latch had been. His eyes moved across the lines slowly, then faster, then stopped entirely, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. The name was there, clear, undeniable, Clara Whitmore, written in a hand that belonged to the state, backed by a seal that marked ownership not just of land but of everything built upon it, including the very ground the saloon stood on, including the bar his hands now gripped too tightly. The realization did not come all at once. It settled in pieces, each one heavier than the last. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had drawn in without moving. And Clara still had not raised her voice. She had not claimed anything. She had not needed to, because the truth had stepped into the room with her, and now it stood where everyone could see it. One of the men near the back let out a quiet breath, not quite a word, more like something leaving him that he had been holding on to without knowing it. The owner looked up then, not at Elias, but at Clara, and for the first time since she walked in, he saw her clearly, not as a stranger, not as someone out of place, but as the person he had just tried to deny in her own house. And the coin between them no longer looked small. It looked deliberate, like a question he had already answered wrong. And Elias finally moved again, just enough to step back, giving the moment room to unfold. Because this was not about force, it never had been. It was about a line being crossed and quietly, unmistakably, drawn back in place. And no one in that room reached for the door anymore, even though it stood right there, because leaving was no longer the hardest thing to do. The paper did not move in the owner's hands, but everything else did. The weight of it shifted the air, bent the posture of men who had walked in thinking they understood the rules of the room, and now found themselves standing inside something they had never bothered to question. The owner swallowed once, slow, his eyes flicking down again to the name, as if it might change if he looked long enough. But it did not. Ink did not bend for pride, and land did not forget who held it. His fingers tightened around the edge of the document before he carefully set it back down on the bar, not where it had been, but slightly closer to Clara, a distance so small it might have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But here it spoke louder than apology. Clara finally lifted her hand from the wood, not to take the paper, not to claim it again, but simply to rest it beside the coin, her presence enough. She did not need to reach for what was already hers. Her gaze moved across the room slowly, not accusing, not demanding, just seeing. And that alone made a few men lower their eyes into their glasses as if the amber liquid might offer somewhere to hide. The owner cleared his throat, the sound dry, unfamiliar, like a man who had spoken all his life but never needed to choose his words carefully until now. "Miss Whitmore," he said, the name sitting awkward on his tongue, heavier than the insult had been, because respect, when it arrives late, always costs more to carry. He reached for a clean glass this time, not out of habit but intention, setting it down in front of her with both hands, careful, deliberate, and poured water. Not rushing, not spilling. The simple act done with a kind of focus that bordered on reverence. The liquid caught the light as it filled the glass, clear, steady, unquestioned, just as it should have been from the beginning. Clara watched the water rise without expression, then looked at the glass, then at the coin still resting between them, and for a moment it seemed like she might leave it there. Let it remain as a reminder of the line that had been drawn, but instead she slid it forward, slow, smooth, until it reached the edge of the bar. Not pushed, not offered, simply placed where it belonged, because fairness was not something she needed to argue for. It was something she carried with her. The owner hesitated before taking the coin, his fingers brushing it lightly, as if unsure whether he had earned the right to accept it. But he did, because she had decided he could, and that was the difference now, not power, but permission. Elias Carter stood a few steps back, his role already finished, his eyes moving once across the room to mark what had changed and what had not, and then settling briefly on Clara, not with approval, not with question, just with the quiet understanding of someone who knew when a moment had reached its true end. And when he turned toward the door, no one stopped him, no one spoke, because the lesson had already been given, not with force, not with threat, but with something far harder to ignore, the simple weight of being seen clearly for the first time. And outside, the wind moved across the street the same as it had before, carrying dust and distance, as if nothing had changed at all, except inside, where no one would forget how it felt when the room itself decided to tell the truth. The door opened with a quiet ease when Elias Carter lifted the latch, the sound softer this time, as if the room itself had learned something about weight, and he stepped out into the late afternoon light without looking back, the sun low enough to stretch long shadows across the wooden street. But inside, no one moved to follow him, not yet, because leaving would mean carrying what had just happened out into the open. And some things felt heavier once they touched daylight. Clara Whitmore remained where she stood at the bar, the glass of water untouched for a moment longer, her fingers resting lightly against the edge as if feeling the coolness before deciding anything else. The owner stood across from her, posture straighter now, but not with pride, with awareness, a different kind of tension settling into his shoulders, the kind that comes when a man realizes he has been standing wrong for a long time, and must now decide how to stand right. One of the men, near the window, cleared his throat and set a few coins on his table, more than he owed, not as a show, not for attention, just a quiet adjustment. Another followed, slower, placing his hat back on his head, as if preparing to step outside into a world that had not changed but would feel different to him anyway. The room began to move again in small ways, chairs shifting, boots turning, but no one rushed, no one laughed. The easy noise that had filled the space before Clara walked in did not return, because something had replaced it, something steadier, harder to shake loose. Clara finally lifted the glass and took a slow drink. The water simple, clean, exactly what she had asked for. Nothing more, nothing less. And when she set it back down, she did not look around for approval, did not wait for acknowledgement. She reached for the folded document and the small emblem, sliding them back toward herself with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, not reclaiming, just gathering what had never left her in the first place. The owner watched her hands, then met her eyes briefly, not holding the gaze, but not avoiding it either, a balance he had not known before. And he gave a slight nod, not formal, not practiced, just real. Clara returned nothing outwardly, but she did not need to, because respect, once understood, does not require repetition. She turned then, her boots steady against the floor as she walked toward the door, passing the tables, the men who now shifted. Just enough to give her space without making it obvious. The kind of movement that spoke louder than any apology ever could. When she reached the entrance, she paused only long enough to push the door open, the same door that had been closed moments before, and as it swung outward, the light poured in, wide and unfiltered, dust lifting gently in the air. She stepped through without hesitation, the wind catching the edge of her hair and the hem of her vest, carrying with it the quiet certainty of someone who did not need the world to change in order to walk through it differently. And behind her, the door remained open, no latch, no barrier, just a space where anyone could leave. But for a few seconds longer, no one did, because sometimes the hardest step is not the one that takes you outside, but the one that makes you understand who you were before you even try. Outside, the air felt different, not because the wind had changed, but because Clara Whitmore carried something lighter than when she had walked in. Though she had taken nothing new with her, the street stretched quiet under the late sun, wooden buildings casting long shadows that reached toward one another without ever touching, and a few distant figures moved along the far end, unaware that anything had shifted inside the saloon behind her. She paused just a few steps from the door, not turning back, just listening, because sometimes silence says more once you leave it. And behind her, the room finally began to release its hold on those still inside. One man stepped out first, hat low, eyes forward, not looking at her, not because he refused, but because he understood that looking now would mean admitting something he had only just begun to see. Another followed, slower, pausing at the threshold as if measuring the space he was about to re-enter, and then more came, not together, not as a group, but one by one, each carrying their own quiet realization into the open air. None of them spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, only something left to remember. Clara adjusted the small silver pendant at her collarbone without thinking, the motion subtle, familiar, grounding, and then she began to walk, her steps steady along the wooden boards that led toward the wider road beyond town, the dust lifting softly around her boots with each step, the same dust that had followed her in, but now it did not cling the same way. And across the street, leaning against a post as if he had been there long before any of this began, Elias Carter watched her approach, his hat tipped just enough to shade his eyes, his expression unchanged. But there was something settled in the way he stood, something finished. He did not speak when she drew near, and she did not stop, not at first, because what had happened inside did not require words to complete it. But after a few steps past him, Clara slowed, just enough to acknowledge his presence without turning it into a moment, and Elias shifted his weight slightly, the wood beneath his boot giving a soft creak. He glanced toward the saloon door, now open wide, then back toward the road ahead, and in that small movement, something unspoken passed between them again, not gratitude, not obligation, just recognition of a line that had been held without either of them needing to cross it. Clara continued forward, the horizon stretching out beyond the last building, wide and open, the kind of space that did not belong to anyone until someone chose to stand in it. And behind them, the town settled back into itself, quieter, slower, as if it had taken a breath it did not know it needed. And though no one would speak of it the same way, though no sign would be posted and no rule would be written, something had shifted in the way that door would open the next time. Because sometimes the strongest change does not come from force, but from the simple fact that once seen clearly, a truth does not allow itself to be unseen again. The road stretched ahead in a long pale line, fading into heat and distance, but Clara Whitmore did not rush toward it. She walked at the same measured pace she had carried inside, as if nothing behind her had earned the right to change her rhythm. The town lingered at her back, wood and dust, and quiet conversations beginning to find their way again, though softer now, more careful, and somewhere behind, a hammer struck once against metal, a sound that felt ordinary but carried a different weight. After what had passed, Elias Carter remained by the post a moment longer, watching the space Clara left behind rather than the woman herself, because he knew better than to follow something that was already moving forward on its own terms. He adjusted the brim of his hat and stepped away from the shade, the sunlight catching the worn edge of his coat, his boots finding the dirt with a steady certainty, not chasing, not catching up, just walking in the same direction because sometimes paths align without needing agreement. Clara heard the faint crunch of steps behind her, but did not turn, not immediately. She let the sound exist, measured it, understood it, and only when the distance between them settled into something even did she speak. Her voice calm, carried lightly by the wind. "You did not have to close that door," she said, not as a question, not as a complaint, just a statement laid flat between them. Elias walked a few steps more before answering, his voice low, steady. "No," he said. But they had to hear it close, and that was all. No explanation followed, none needed. Clara gave a slight nod, more to herself than to him, and the two continued along the road, side by side now, but not quite together. The space between them intentional, comfortable, like two riders, sharing a trail without needing to ride in line. The town behind them grew smaller with each step, its edges softening into the land, but its memory stayed sharp in a way that would not fade easily. A wagon creaked in the distance, somewhere far off, and a bird crossed overhead, cutting a quiet path through the open sky. Clara reached into her vest and adjusted the folded document once more, not out of worry, but habit, the same way a person checks something valuable not because it might be lost, but because it matters. Elias glanced once at the horizon, then at her, his expression unchanged but thoughtful in a way that did not ask for anything. And after a while, he slowed, just slightly, enough that the path ahead belonged fully to her again. Clara did not stop, did not look back. She simply continued forward, her figure steady against the wide land. And Elias watched for a moment before turning his own steps toward a different line in the distance, not because their paths had ended, but because they had never needed to be the same. And behind them, the town carried on, but not quite as it had before, because some doors, once closed for the right reason, never sound the same when they open again. The land opened wider with every step. Clara Whitmore took, the last buildings of the town dissolving into distance behind her like something already decided. The road beneath her boots turning from worn boards to packed earth, then to a faint trail that only existed because enough people had chosen it before. The wind carried the dry scent of sage and dust, brushing lightly against her face, lifting strands of her chestnut hair, as if reminding her she was no longer inside walls built by other men's rules. She did not slow, but her steps grew quieter, more natural, like she was returning to something that had always belonged to her rather than leaving something behind. The sun had begun its slow drop, stretching gold across the plains, turning everything it touched into something softer, even the hard lines of fences and distant ridges. And ahead, the outline of her ranch came into view, small at first, then clearer, a structure built not for show but for endurance, wood-weathered by years, a roof that had seen storms and held through them, a place that did not ask who you were before letting you in. A horse stood near the fence, lifting its head as she approached, recognizing her before she spoke, its ears forward, still, attentive. Clara reached the gate and pushed it open with a quiet ease, the hinge giving a soft, familiar sound that felt more like welcome than warning. She stepped inside without hesitation, her hand brushing briefly along the top rail as she passed, grounding herself in the simple truth of wood and work and land that answered only to those who cared for it. Behind her, the wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint echo of town life far away, but it no longer reached her the same way, not because it had disappeared, but because it no longer held weight here. She walked toward the porch, her boots leaving light impressions in the dirt that would fade by morning, and paused just before stepping up, not out of uncertainty, but to take in the quiet, the kind that was not empty but full, filled with the small sounds of the land settling into evening, a distant creak of wood, the low movement of air through grass, the steady presence of something that did not need to prove itself. Clara reached into her vest once more, pulling out the folded document, holding it for a moment in the fading light, not reading it, not checking it, just feeling its presence. Then she slipped it back into place, secure, untouched by doubt, because ownership was not something she needed to remind herself of. It was something she lived with every step she took across this ground. She moved up onto the porch then, the boards firm beneath her, and opened the door to her home. The interior dim but familiar, a space shaped by her choices, her labor, her time. And as she stepped inside, she did not carry the weight of the saloon with her. She left it where it belonged, behind her, in a room that had learned something it would not forget. And as the door closed softly at her back, the last light of the day settled across the land, quiet, steady, unchanged, yet not the same as before. Morning came slow across the ranch, not with noise but with light, a thin line of gold slipping over the horizon and stretching across the land until it found the edges of Clara Whitmore's home, touching the wood, the fence, the quiet stillness that had settled there overnight. She was already awake before the sun cleared the hills, moving through the small space with the kind of familiarity that did not require thought. A kettle warmed over low flame, boots set near the door, the rhythm of her morning unchanged, because whatever had shifted in town had not altered the work that waited here, outside. The air held a coolness that would burn away by noon, and the horse by the fence shifted its weight, glancing toward the house, as if sensing movement before it was seen. Clara stepped out onto the porch with a tin cup in hand, the warmth rising lightly against her fingers, and she paused there for a moment, not out of habit, but to listen. The land spoke differently at dawn, quieter, more honest, no voices, no expectations, just the steady presence of something that did not need to prove itself. She took a slow drink and set the cup down on the rail, her eyes moving across the property, checking without urgency, fence lines intact, gate closed, nothing out of place. And yet, something felt different, not wrong, just noticed, like a thread pulled slightly from a fabric that still held together. She stepped down from the porch and walked toward the gate, her boots pressing into the dirt with a soft certainty. And as she reached it, she saw what had changed, a set of fresh tracks just beyond the fence line. Not many, not scattered, but deliberate, a single horse, ridden steady, arriving at some point before dawn and stopping just long enough to leave a mark. Clara crouched slightly, studying the imprint without touching it, the depth, the angle, the way the dirt had settled back around it. She did not need to guess whose it was, not because the mark was unique, but because the timing was. Elias Carter did not ride without reason, and he did not leave signs without meaning. Clara straightened and looked out toward the open land, the horizon wide and empty, offering no answers and no urgency. She did not follow the tracks, did not call out. She simply noted them, let them exist as they were, a message without words. And she turned back toward the house, her pace unchanged, because whatever had been set in motion the night before had not ended at the saloon. It had only shifted shape, and here, on her land, she would meet it the same way she had met everything else, not with haste, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that some changes do not arrive loudly. They arrive in small signs, waiting to be recognized by the one person who knows how to see them. Clara Whitmore moved through the morning as she always had, but her awareness stayed just a fraction sharper, like a string pulled tighter across an instrument. Not enough to change the melody, but enough to alter the tone. She checked the far fence line next, walking the length of it with slow, deliberate steps, her hand brushing lightly along the wood at intervals, feeling for anything out of place, a loose nail, a shift in tension, something that did not belong, but everything held steady. The land answered her the same way it always had, with quiet consistency, and yet the thought of those tracks remained, not as a worry, but as a presence, like a word left unsaid in a conversation that had not quite finished. She reached the far corner where the fence turned and paused, looking out over the stretch of open ground beyond her property, the grass low and dry, moving in soft waves under the wind. And there, at a distance just beyond where her land ended, she saw him. Elias Carter sat on his horse, still as if he had been placed there by the horizon itself, not hidden, not approaching, just present, his posture relaxed but intentional, one hand resting lightly near the reins, the other loose at his side. He had not crossed onto her land, not even a step, the line between them clear and respected. Clara did not call out. She did not raise a hand. She simply stood where she was, meeting the moment with the same quiet steadiness she had carried the night before. The distance between them held something unspoken, not tension, not hesitation, just a space where understanding could exist without being forced. The wind moved between them, carrying dust and the faint scent of sun-warmed earth, and after a long moment, Elias shifted slightly in the saddle, enough to signal awareness. Without urgency, his gaze steady, not searching, not asking, just confirming what he already knew, that she had seen the tracks, that she had understood, and Clara gave the smallest nod, barely a movement, more felt than seen, and that was enough. Elias turned his horse then, not sharply, not in retreat, but with the ease of someone who had come only to deliver something without words and now had no reason to stay. The horse stepped forward, its hooves pressing into the earth with a quiet rhythm that matched the land itself, and he rode along the edge of her property for a short distance before angling away, the line of his path clear against the open ground, and Clara watched until he became part of the horizon again, not disappearing, just folding back into the space he had come from. She stood there a moment longer, the wind brushing past her, carrying nothing new now, only what had already been understood. And then she turned back toward the house, her steps steady, unchanged, because whatever had been set in motion did not need to be chased. It would come when it was ready, and she would meet it the same way she had met everything else, standing where she belonged, without needing to step beyond it. By midday the sun stood high and unforgiving, pressing heat into the land until even the wind felt slower, heavier, and Clara Whitmore worked through it without pause. Her sleeves rolled just enough, her movements steady as she checked the water trough near the far pasture, the surface reflecting the sky in a quiet shimmer that broke only when the horse stepped closer to drink. She watched the ripples settle, the way disturbance always gave way to calm if left alone, and that thought stayed with her longer than it should have, not as distraction, but as recognition, because the morning had not brought answers, only confirmation that something had begun, and not everything that begins demands to be followed. Some things ask only to be acknowledged. She straightened and wiped her hands against the side of her vest, her gaze drifting once more toward the edge of her land, not expecting to see anything now, but still aware of that invisible line where presence had been and then was not. The silence there felt different, not empty, but intentional, like a space left open on purpose. She turned back toward the barn, stepping into its shade where the air cooled just enough to shift her breathing. The scent of hay and wood grounding her in something immediate, something known. She moved through the tasks waiting for her, checking the latch on the stall, adjusting a loose strap, small things that held the structure of her day together. And yet, even in that rhythm, she felt it, not tension, not unease, but a quiet awareness that her world had been seen from the outside and returned without disturbance, and that mattered more than any action could. A soft sound reached her then, not from the open land, but from the direction of the road, distant at first, then clearer, the steady roll of wagon wheels against packed dirt. Slow, unhurried, Clara stepped back into the sunlight and looked toward the path that led to her gate. A single wagon approached, not rushed, not hesitant, drawn by a pair of tired but steady horses. And as it came closer, she recognized the driver, one of the men from town, not the loudest, not the one who had spoken, but one who had sat in silence, watching, the kind of man who had understood more than he had shown. He brought the wagon to a stop just outside her fence and climbed down without calling out, removing his hat as he approached the gate, his steps measured, respectful. He did not open it, did not cross. He simply stood there, waiting. Clara walked toward him, her pace even, her expression unchanged, and when she reached the fence, they stood facing each other with the wood between them, not as a barrier, but as a line both understood. The man cleared his throat softly, his eyes not quite meeting hers at first, then lifting, steadying. "Miss Whitmore," he said, the name spoken carefully, like something he had chosen to get right this time, and he gestured back toward the wagon, where a crate sat secured in the bed, simple, unmarked. "The owner sent this," he continued, his voice quiet but clear, "said it was owed." And he said no more, because nothing more needed to be said. Clara looked past him at the crate, then back at the man, and for a moment the space between them held the weight of something that was not apology and not explanation, but something closer to acknowledgement, and she gave a small nod, not accepting yet, not refusing, just recognizing what had arrived. Because sometimes what follows a moment of truth is not change spoken aloud, but change carried quietly to your door. The man did not move to open the crate, and Clara Whitmore did not ask him to. The space between them held steady, defined not by distance, but by understanding. She stepped closer to the gate and rested her hand lightly on the top rail, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood as she considered what had been brought to her, not as a gift, not as a transaction, but as something placed carefully in the space where a mistake had once been made. The man shifted his weight slightly, still holding his hat in both hands now, his posture not uneasy but aware, as if he understood that what mattered here was not whether she accepted the crate, but how she chose to respond to it. Clara glanced once toward the wagon, taking in the crate without lingering on it, its edges worn but sturdy, tied down with rope that had been secured with care, not haste, and that detail did not escape her, because intention always leaves a mark. Even in small things, she lifted her gaze back to the man and spoke quietly, her voice even. Did he say what was inside? Not as suspicion, not as doubt, just as clarity. The man shook his head once, slow. No, ma'am, he replied. Then after a brief pause added, just said it was yours to decide. And that answer settled into the moment with a kind of quiet honesty that did not need anything more added to it. Clara nodded slightly, her hand leaving the fence as she stepped back, not retreating, just creating space enough to choose without pressure. She walked to the gate and opened it herself, the hinge moving smoothly under her hand. And for a moment the line between them disappeared, not erased, just crossed with intention. She gestured once toward the wagon, a simple motion, and the man understood, moving back to untie the rope, his movements careful, respectful of the crate as if it carried more than its weight suggested. He lifted it down and set it just inside the fence, not too close, not too far, then stepped back again, leaving it where it could be seen without being imposed. Clara approached it slowly, her steps measured, the same way she had approached every moment since the night before. She knelt slightly and placed her hand on the top, feeling the rough wood beneath her palm, grounding herself in something tangible before lifting the lid. The hinges gave a soft sound as it opened, and inside, there was no excess, no show, just a collection of simple things. Supplies carefully packed, flour, dried goods, tools, items a ranch depended on, each one chosen not for display, but for use, and beneath them, placed flat against the bottom, a small folded piece of paper. Clara reached for it and unfolded it slowly, the handwriting rough but deliberate, only a few words written across it, not long enough to explain, not polished enough to impress, just enough to be clear. She read it once, then folded it again without speaking, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes settled, not softened, just aligned. She closed the crate gently and stood, turning back toward the man, who still waited without shifting his place. She gave a small nod, not gratitude, not dismissal, just acknowledgement, and said, "You can tell him it arrived." Nothing more, because nothing more was needed. The man nodded in return, placing his hat back on his head, and after a moment, he stepped back onto the wagon, guiding the horses to turn, the wheels rolling slow and steady as he made his way back toward town, leaving Clara standing by the open gate, the crate at her side, the land stretching out beyond her, and in that quiet space, something had been returned, not equal to what had been taken, but enough to show that someone had understood where the line had been drawn, and chosen not to cross it again. The wagon disappeared into the distance until it became nothing more than a faint shape against the pale road, and then even that was gone, leaving only the quiet stretch of land and the soft whisper of wind moving through dry grass. Clara Whitmore stood by the open gate a moment longer, not watching for anything to return, but letting the stillness settle fully. The crate remained where it had been placed, solid, real, not as a burden and not as a favor, just something that now belonged to her. Because she had allowed it to, she reached down and closed the gate with a gentle push, the latch falling into place with a sound so ordinary it almost disappeared, but it marked something complete, not locked, not guarded, just set. She carried the crate toward the house with steady steps, not rushing, not delaying, the weight of it balanced in her arms, manageable, chosen, and when she set it down on the porch, the wood beneath it gave a quiet response, as if acknowledging the addition. Without question, The sun had begun to lower again, the light shifting from harsh brightness to something warmer, softer, the kind that stretched shadows long across the ground and made everything appear both clearer and more distant at the same time. Clara opened the crate once more, not to inspect, but to place each item where it belonged: flour into the pantry, tools onto their hooks, each movement simple, deliberate, nothing wasted, nothing left idle, until only the folded note remained. She held it for a brief moment, turning it once between her fingers, not rereading it, not needing to. Then she placed it inside a small wooden box near the door, alongside a few other things that carried meaning without needing explanation, and closed the lid. Outside, the horse shifted again near the fence, lowering its head back to the ground, the rhythm of the ranch returning fully, unchanged in its demands, steady in its expectations. Clara stepped back onto the porch, her hands free now, her posture relaxed but certain. She looked out over the land, the same land that had been hers before any of this had begun, the same land that would remain after it had passed. And for a moment, nothing moved, not the wind, not the grass, not even the distant line of the horizon, as if the world itself had paused just long enough to recognize the quiet balance that had been restored. And then the breeze returned, gentle, carrying with it no voices, no echoes, just the open space ahead. Clara turned slightly, resting one hand against the doorframe, her gaze steady, not searching, not waiting, simply present, because out here, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It settled in the spaces between actions, in the choices that followed, in the lines that were drawn and then respected. And as the last light of the day stretched across the ranch, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to take back. Only the quiet understanding that some doors do not need to stay closed to be remembered, and some things, once seen clearly, remain that way long after the moment has passed.